It is little known that Mirza Beg Asadullah Khan, better known as Mirza Ghalib, arguably one of the greatest Urdu poets, and by some reckoning, the greatest Urdu poet, was an unsparing editor of his own poetry. During his period from December 27th, 1797 to February 15th, 1869, Ghalib started writing poetry rather early in his life. A large number of poems and verses that Ghalib rejected or edited out from his published works are known as Mustarad Kalam, which literally means rejected verses. Professor Mehr Afshan Farooqi of the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Literatures at the University of Virginia has been working on those verses for over a decade. The result is a much anticipated book, Flowers in a Mirror, a critical commentary. The book follows Professor Farooqi's acclaimed first biography of Ghalib A Wilderness at My Doorstep. Dr. Farooqi spoke to Mayank Reports. Welcome to Mayank Reports, Professor Farooqi. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. In your first Ghalib biography, A Wilderness at My Doorstep, you pointed out that Ghalib's poetic trajectory begins from Urdu and then switches almost entirely to Persian and finally back to Urdu. Persian, according to you, took precedence over Urdu for him. Talk a bit more about that. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, this is a question that came to my mind when I started exploring Ghalib, because mostly we recognize him as an Urdu poet, right? As one of the best Urdu poets. But he actually has written far more in Persian than in Urdu. So his Persian divan is 5 times the size of his Urdu divan, so much more. I think Ghalib, being the genius that he was and how perceptive he was, he had a very modern mind. So he realized that Urdu is still a regional language, whereas Persian is a language that extends beyond the frontiers of South Asia. So that is why when he went to Calcutta, and also early on, he wrote a little bit in Farsi, but mostly he did in Urdu. So he realized the potential of his poetry going beyond the borders, going beyond the boundaries. And he also understood that the literary tradition of Farsi is very long and deep. And eventually it also connects with Sanskrit, right? When you go all the way back to pre-modern Farsi, you go to Avestan, and there's all this connection. So he was very fascinated by all of this. He wanted to explore actually the pre-modern Farsi as well. He wanted to see what it was like.
I see. Was he educated in Persian?
Yeah, I think in those days people grew up learning Persian because it was a classical language, and any kind of formal education. I think it didn't have anything to do with religion or region. If you were educated, you learned Farsi.
Right, right. How did the fact that his era, when we are talking 1797 to 1869, which
Hmm.
coincided with the ever increasing stranglehold of the British Raj,
Hmm.
impact his outlook as a poet? And just as an aside, I'm mentioning this. Ghalib died on February 15th, 1869,
Yeah.
about 8 months before a certain Mohandas Gandhi was born.
Hmm. True. So Ghalib lived at the crossroads of history. Unlike Mir Taqi Mir, who was his senior and also a very great poet, Ghalib's Delhi was British Delhi, because by 1802 the British had captured Delhi in a way that the Mughal ruler had been almost, he was only he was only a titular head. So, the saying was, something like that he was a very, the Mughal court had shrunk, and Ghalib's father and his uncle and his grandfather, they were all working for different people. So Ghalib's father was working for the Raja of Alwar, and he died when Ghalib was only 4 years old. Ghalib's uncle, that means his father's brother, was working for Lord Lake. His grandfather was, because once Delhi was occupied by the British and Agra also, obviously all the people who were involved in the military or in higher levels of administration, and in those days the civil and the military were almost, fused together. There wasn't a distinct difference between the two, because if you were a governor, you were expected to have an army, keep a active support. So in that regard, Ghalib actually rubbed shoulders with the British. He was friends with the Delhi resident, and his times were quite different and challenging at the same time.
Perhaps it's a silly question, but I'm curious. Did Ghalib understand English? Did he speak English?
No, I don't think he did. That's a
Yeah,
very good question, though.
I thought because it's someone who was that literate otherwise, his worldview. I thought might have, if someone could pick a Persian and write such fantastic verses, English would have been an easy thing relatively, right?
um, I don't know. I guess he was too proud of his own culture, and he was too proud of what he was doing. He was certainly fond of foreign liquor. He liked champagne.
Indeed, we know that. Yes.
Yeah, we know that.
Yeah, yeah. To change gears a bit, to come to your the reason why we are doing this, your second Ghalib book, Flowers
Yeah,
in a Mirror. It,
yeah,
from what I understand, I haven't read it yet, but from what I understand, it focuses on Mustarad Kalam, or rejected or cancelled verses, as it were.
yeah,
What
yes.
was the reason to choose those?
Uh-huh. Yeah, so few people are aware of the fact that Ghalib was a very strict editor of his own work, and when he decided to publish his divan, he he went through his the poems that he had composed, and he took out more than half of it. Um, this could have been because now he was going to share his poetry with a wider audience, because earlier the audience would be the audience in mushairas, or the elite people who would get copies of the divan made, a calligraphed copy, which would be very exclusive. So there was a very limited number of people who would actually be holding the poetry in their hands or reading it. And now with publication, obviously anybody who had the money could afford to buy the book. So Ghalib, who was very sensitive to criticism and who had been criticized for writing difficult poetry, he felt that he needed to present verses that were relatively easier for people to understand.
Right.
And so in the process, he took out more than half of his poetry.
That's a lot. How did you come to discover those? Were they compiled in some fashion? I'm ignorant about that.
Yeah. So actually, people had forgotten about it soon after Ghalib's death. But since he was such a household name, and different editions of Diwan Ghalib were being brought out, people were always looking out for manuscripts of his divans. And in the state of Bhopal, there was this famous library, and it, and a divan of Ghalib was found there, and that divan was from 1821. And it was authentic, and then people saw that, the person who discovered it saw that it had all these ghazals that were not included in the published divan. This happened in 1918. So Ghalib dies in 1869, and in 1918, after the influenza epidemic, this divan is discovered. And so the question was what to do with it, because it contained poetry that Ghalib had decided not to publish. So, should those poems be published? And this was a big debate that went on in the 1920s. But ultimately, the state of Bhopal published the Diwan and called it the Diwan-e-Jadid, that means the new Diwan of Ghalib. So that's how the poetry was recovered. But it didn't really attract a lot of people, because mostly people were focused on that small divan that Ghalib himself had curated. And in spite of some, uh, more scholarly editions of Ghalib's divan, it continued to be ignored.
I see. Was there some sort of a Ghalib estate? How did the state of Bhopal, you said, come to
Mhm.
publish it? Did they have the permission, or in those days you didn't need those things?
No, in those days you didn't. And, the libraries of these regional rulers were very rich.
Right.
And the Begum of Bhopal, who was, her son was also a poet, and there were connections with Ghalib. So somebody must have,
I see. Right. Right. What do his cancelled verses reveal to you in terms of his inner personality, not just as a poet,
hmm,
but as a human being?
that's a very good question. So the early verses are the verses of from his youth, right?
Right.
In a he was still very young, 19 years old, and he was more philosophical and more focused on existential crisis at that time, because he was going through this phase of his relatives I mean that his relatives from his marriage, from his wife's side, they were very, very well to do, very rich, and he came from a fairly wealthy background. But because his father died when he was only 4 years old, and then his uncle, who was also very well to do, he was a very famous commander. He died when Ghalib was 9. So Ghalib became an orphan very early, and I think those things were uh, made him focus a lot on existential crisis, and also on the philosophy of being and non-being, the Vedantic philosophy.
Right.
So his early poetry is more philosophical,
Right.
and therefore it is very dense, because he's focusing on things like illusion and reality, being and non-being. There's a very famous share that I think you might even have heard.
Yes. I
न
can guess
न
it.
था
Yes.
कुछ तो खुदा था, है ना? न
Right.
था
Right.
कुछ तो खुदा था, कुछ न होता तो खुदा होता, डुबोया मुझको होने ने, न होता मैं तो क्या होता.
Yeah, that's
So
fantastic. It's almost quantum mechanical.
it's almost like quantum physics. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting you should, because I did a documentary on Narsi Mehta, the writer of Vaishnava Janato. If you
Mm-hmm.
read some of his poetry, it's equally quantum mechanical. It's Vedantic, like in Ghalib's case. Anyway, I'm glad you mentioned it. I was going to ask this question a little later, but since you talked about his fascination with the concept of illusion, there
Yes.
is a famous one, which is one of my all-time favorite verses by him. हस्ती के बद फरेब में आ जाइयो
आ
असद
जाइयो असद. हाँ.
आलम तमाम हल्का है दामे ख्याल है. It is profound.
It's
It
very
is
profound.
the idea that you shouldn't be taken in by the deceptions or lures of existence. It is
Hmm.
fascinating. Talk a bit more about that, since you paid so much attention to these ideas.
So he was somebody who also was fascinated with the power of imagination, because imagination is what leads to illusion and reality, right? I mean, if humans didn't have the power of imagination, which is what distinguishes us from animals, right? Because all living creatures are basically, the same, because we eat, we grow old, we die. But
Right.
imagination is something that is so typical for humans, and also the way they use language. And these were some of the things that make Ghalib so special among Urdu and even Farsi poets, because of his engagement with this fine line between illusion and reality. And another famous sher which I will recite for you is "Hai kahan tamanna ka dusra qadam ya Rab." Where is the next step of longing, O God? हमने दश्त इम्का को एक नक्श पा पाया. I
Wonderful.
found, I found the wilderness of imagination to be just one footprint.
It's
So,
fantastic.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
So the Dashta Imka, that is the realm of possibilities.
right.
He
Uh,
has crossed it in one step. Even
absolutely.
in the second step.
Absolutely. Professor Farooqi, it strikes me that all poets have conceit.
Yes.
In fact, all art begins from conceit. The
Hmm.
idea that you want to write something or create something that you presume that someone other than you would like it. To me, it's very conceited. And speaking of conceit, बाजी चाहे अतफाल है दुनिया मेरे आगे होता
होता
है
है
शबो
शब
रोज. I
रोज.
mean, it's almost profoundly patronizing in some ways to me that he thinks it's a children's playground in front of me. Uh, I,
Mhm.
I'm quite struck by those verses.
Well, you see, you have to then dive again into the Vedantic and Indic philosophy, in which the concept of Leela comes into
Right.
play. Creativity is something that poets share with God,
Yeah.
right? God is a creator, and the poet is also a creator.
Right.
And in that regard, Bazi Chayat Fal hai duniya mere aage, because
Right.
I can, with my words, explore the realm of possibilities. I can go beyond imagination, even. So, and he does. So, in this way, there is this wonderful connection between creativity and and God, and how it is reflected in humans. I mean, Iqbal was another poet who kind of explored this, because there's a poem by Iqbal in which he talks about Earth welcoming Adam, and he says, now there's a world of possibilities before you, Adam. You have
Right.
been rejected from paradise.
True. True.
But
Uh, would you call his cancel verses sort of his way of balancing the conflicts that he may have faced?
hmm, I think I think it has to do with his perceptive mind, of the way he is reading his audience, the way he's reading the power of print. And this is something that I've explored in my first book, and something pretty new as far as other writings on Ghalib and in fact in Indian literary history go, because we kind of made this transition from manuscript to print culture,
Right.
and from orality to written. Those things are going on at the same time. And when you look at the manuscripts of Ghalib's Diwan, you find that they're beautiful, they're illustrated, there's gold, there's blue, there's all this. But when you look at his first published Diwan, it's such an ordinary little
Right.
book. It's so, the paper is ordinary, the everything about it is very ordinary, but then it becomes this powerful tool which makes him a household name. So
Right.
there is so much. going on in terms of transitioning
Hmm.
um, from a pre-modern to a modern way of thinking. I
Right.
mean, it didn't happen overnight. It was happening throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's not something that happened overnight. It just happens that Ghalib is at that important crossroads.
Absolutely, yeah. You've also spoken about Ghalib's far-fetched metaphors and unusual phrases, which you say is often borrowed from Farsi to dress up as ambiguous verses. These are your words. Uh,
Yes.
explain a bit.
So he, Urdu, you have to see that Urdu poetry had developed very quickly. And because it was a mixture of several, vocabulary drawn from Farsi, mainly the grammar is Indian, it's Kariboli, and then into it we mix Farsi and words borrowed from Arabic, Sanskrit, everything is there. Um, but how many, Urdu prose doesn't develop until much later. So Urdu poetry comes before Urdu prose, which is fairly common in our, in the South Asian languages. And Ghalib is dabbling with a lot of philosophical stuff, which probably needs a strong linguistic background. So he invents new phrases. He invents new combinations, and he also borrows from Persian some very rare and unusual phrases,
I see.
which make his poetry actually difficult.
Exactly. Yes.
Because if you don't know the meaning of those phrases and they're not being used, you get
He,
stuck and then you need help.
to be perfectly facetious, he sounds like the Shashi Tharoor of the day.
Yeah, even his prose in Farsi is very convoluted, but then in Urdu he writes beautiful prose.
Right.
It's a
You know,
very interesting subject to pursue. I mean, I'd probably do another book on Ghalib. I'll do a
that would be
third book.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
I'll probably now do a book on his prose.
okay. One of your major points about Ghalib has been his passion for neologisms or coinage of new words.
Yes, yeah.
Uh,
Mhm.
was it true of his contemporaries or even those who were in the same league? Did they do the same thing or it's unique to Ghalib?
I think it's people did do that, but Ghalib did it in a greater measure. So
I see.
Ghalib's poetry has many, many more, new words and phrases that he has invented or that he has, yeah, hybridization.
I see.
He does that a lot. Um,
Yeah.
and I, so you compare him to Mir because whenever we talk about who is the greater poet, is it
Right.
Mir or Ghalib? It's like oranges and apples because Mir's distinctiveness lies in writing poetry in simple language,
Exactly.
and Ghalib is the opposite. His language, at least till 1850, is very very convoluted, and then when he returns to Urdu after 1850, the
Right.
last phase of his career, then he writes very reasonably simple. Ibn Maryam hua kare koi,
Right.
mere dukh ki dawa kare koi, or there are many.
Right. Right. To change gears a bit, last year marked the 225th anniversary of his birth. I had written a piece where this was my view, of course. I had said that in some sense,
Hmm,
Ghalib is to poetry what Albert Einstein is to physics.
hmm.
People have a clear sense of their genius, but only rather amorphous comprehension of it. Do you think that continues to be true with Ghalib? Because people know Ghalib and they think they like him and etc.
I don't
yeah.
think they get a full measure of what his genius was.
Definitely, definitely. Because see, a lot of us love Ghalib because he is quoted so often and he has been sung by all the major singers, right?
Right.
Even and even now, people who cannot even read Urdu sing
Yeah.
Ghalib, right? I mean, you can read him in Nagri,
Right.
you can sing him, but they become when they sing a particular ghazal, they're very selective. They only choose the verses that can at least be approachable. For example, दिल नादा तुझे हुआ क्या है आखिर इस दर्द की दवा क्या है हमें मुश्ताक और वो बेजार या इलाही ये माजरा क्या है. But if you continue in this ghazal, it becomes very metaphysical.
Yes, it does.
It becomes terribly metaphysical and convoluted, but nobody sings those verses, right?
No.
Nobody sings those verses.
Yeah.
You jump from there to हमको उनसे वफा की है उम्मीद जो नहीं जानते वफा क्या है, बट उसके पहले जो उन्होंने सब बातें कही है ना,
जी जी
अ,
बिल्कुल.
तो वो तो इस वजह से selectivity is important. I think it's a good
No, it's
thing.
understandable. I mean, after
Yeah.
all, you have to reach a poet of that caliber to ordinary people, and it's
Uh,
perfectly understandable.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know,
I
in
mean,
a sense, reading any poet is
hmm,
essentially second guessing their motivation or eventual intention. It's generally
yeah,
very hard, if not possible, impossible altogether, to divine what might have prompted a poet to say a particular verse. How do you get around that challenge? I mean, he may not have meant any of what we interpret it to mean.
yeah. So the poet's intent shouldn't be the main uh, goal of the reader, particularly if you are reading the poet and not hearing him in a mushaira
Right,
setting, him or her. So, because the mushaira setting is different, the mushaira setting is a, a verbal communication with the audience, right? And in
right.
which you selectively recite certain verses that can evoke a response in the audience. Whereas reading a poet in a divan, you can have a dictionary by your side, you can spend like a whole day on one line.
True.
Sometimes I do that, I spend
I
one
see.
whole day with one verse and I'm trying to understand different ways of looking at it.
But is there a risk of over analyzing what the poet might have meant?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's a risk of over analyzing, but the over analyzing just enhances the pleasure.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
So that is why Ghalib attracted so many commentators, so many, more than 50, almost 100 commentaries on Ghalib are
Right.
there, in which there are online commentaries, there are blogs. I mean, you can't imagine the amount of interest that Ghalib has evoked and continues to evoke. Even now, people are writing blogs on him, sharing his poems and his verses. So,
Absolutely. He is really unique. I mean, Mir Taqi Mir, of course, was regarded in some quarters as a greater poet, but
yes,
nobody talks about Mir with the passion that people talk about
yeah.
Ghalib.
Because Mir is more emotional and Ghalib is more cerebral. So Ghalib excites a certain kind of digging deep into the meaning.
Right. Last couple of things, Professor. I'm interested in your view of a little more elaboration, if you don't mind, on poetic conceit of any poet.
Mhm, mhm,
Why is conceit at the heart of
mhm,
anything that is creative,
mhm.
especially poetry or even painting to some extent? The
Yeah.
idea that Picasso would think that
Mhm,
he'll do two, three lines and people would just go exultant. Not that
mhm,
he's expecting, but I'm sure after a certain stage in his life, both
mhm,
Ghalib and Picasso would have known that I'm on autopilot now. I mean, I can say
mhm,
anything and people would be almost orgasmic about it.
mhm. This is a good question, and I have also thought about it because it ties into this bigger question about why do people write? Why does a poet write? Why does an artist paint? And there can be many answers to it, but there are two broad ways of looking at it, right? One is that there is an inner urge. If you are a poet, you must be knowing that there
Right.
is an inner urge to express, and that sort of takes hold of you, and then you write. Or there is a second thing would be that you want to communicate. So there are
Right.
two things going on. One is that you are responding to your inner urge, and the other
Right.
thing is that you want to communicate, right? So
Exactly.
um, there's something. These two are not mutually exclusive. These two are not mutually exclusive. If you put them together, that you have the urge to write, but you also have the urge to communicate. So then the
Right.
question is, why do you want to communicate, and what are you exactly wanting to communicate?
Right.
है ना?
Yeah.
So
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल जी.
so um, so इस मैं हिंदी में बात करूं क्या?
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल आप I would love that.
हाँ, अक्सर मैं अपने इंटरव्यूज में अंग्रेजी और हिंदी उर्दू के
No, no,
साथ
बिल्कुल. It's
करती
we come from India, so we are used
हूँ।
to.
जी जी हाँ बिल्कुल। तो सवाल ये उठता है कि अ, हम लोग क्लासिक्स को क्यों पढ़ते हैं, है ना? क्लासिकल क्या है? क्लासिकल वो चीज़ है जिसने कि टाइम के टेस्ट को पास कर दिया है। मतलब इट हैज़ गॉन बियॉन्ड टाइम, एंड समथिंग लाइक which was written long, long ago, like when Shakespeare wrote his plays, or when we can go as far back as you want to go. Why is it that people still read those things? Because they have stood the test of time. So they are classics. So, when we think of a literary tradition,
Right.
we think of how can we become a part of that tradition. Because eventually, जैसे टी एस एलियट ने भी कहा था कि एक पोएम से दूसरी पोएम बनती है।
जी.
तो एक कड़ी है जो हमें एक श्रृंखला है जिसमें हम जुड़ते चले जाते हैं, और
Right.
उसी के साथ साथ हमारे अंदर एक चेतना भी होती है जिससे हम चाहते हैं कि हमें पहचान मिले, लोग हमें समझें, हमें जाने। तो उसकी वजह से एक हमारे अंदर एक कंसीट पैदा होती है कि हम अपने लिए एक नाम कमाएं, नाम, दैट इन
जी.
दैट quotes, and that sort of is the root of the conceit that poets and artists have,
Right.
because they have, deep down, they have faith in themselves. However however much they self-doubt, but there is also this faith in what you are writing, and there's also this desire that you will somehow conquer time.
Right. Right. But again, completely on a tangent, and I don't want to be presumptuous in front of you, but like I said, I've written poetry since the age of 13.
Mm-hmm,
And I mean, I'm nowhere of any consequence as a poet by any measure, but I do post a lot of it on my social media handles. And
mm-hmm,
it's fascinating to look at the reaction. Sometimes I would say at least about 60 to maybe even 70% of what I write is entirely mechanical. There is no emotion backing that up. It's just a mechanical process. I'll give you a small example. The other day I wrote just these two lines since I was going to talk to you. Umeed par duniya kaam ho na ho,
mm-hmm.
na umeed par sukhan kaam.
Wow.
Now,
Yeah.
it trust me, when I wake up very early by 4, and I'm almost, like I said, it's like a machine for me. I posted it, and the kind of reaction I got, I was overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm,
People were analyzing. I had to tell them, listen, there's no effort that has gone into it.
mm-hmm,
It's just something that you did. Now, if someone as ordinary as I am as a poet could have that. I'm just thinking of someone like Ghalib, the kind of impact he would have had even when he was alive.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's
he was an important person. He had a record number of shagirds. So one of the ways of assessing a poet's influence is how many shagirds could that poet have. And
Right.
Ghalib has a record number of shagirds. And also, he wasn't, I mean, when in these days we seem to think that Urdu is the language of Muslims and all that. It's not true at all. Urdu is a completely
Well,
secular language.
it's absurd, but anyway, you're right.
It's pretty stupid to think
Yeah.
it like that. And in fact, some of the greatest works on Ghalib have been done by people who were, if you want to use the word Muslim or non-Muslim, like
Exactly.
Malik Ram, like Gyan Chand Jain, all
जी
these
जी
people.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल
They
सही
are
कह रही हैं आप.
major
Yeah.
scholars, and
Yeah.
Ghalib had very close friends who were not Muslim, right?
Right.
And
Right.
his Shiv Narayan, for example, his publisher, Naval Kishore. I mean,
जी.
there's a long list of people.
I mean, it wasn't even an issue by any measure
No,
in
no,
those
not at
days. No,
all. I
no,
mean,
yeah,
Ghalib
yeah,
or Mir or any of those people,
yeah,
they didn't
yeah.
think, they
You know,
didn't think on
before I
those
let you
lines.
go, if, if I know it again, it's I'm distilling it down to the social media world. But if I say Ghalib, what's the worst that immediately comes to your mind? I know it's difficult and perhaps silly too. So,
Yeah, पूछते हैं वो कि गालिब कौन है
aha, okay.
कोई बतलाओ कि हम बतलाएं क्या.
Oh, that's wonderful. Again, look at the conceit.
Yeah, look at the
Uh,
conceit.
this
And
is
also see
fascinating.
the universal appeal of it.
No, it
देखो
is. It
दोनों
is.
चीजें, हाँ कंसीट तो है लेकिन यूनिवर्सल अपील भी तो है.
हाँ जी
आते
बिल्कुल
हैं गैब से ये मजामी ख्याल में,
जी
गालिब तरीर खामा नवाए सरोश है.
yeah.
Ghalib is the voice of angels.
Think about that. Look at I mean I said look at the gumption of that.
Hmm.